Okay, this is chapter 11, Castle Rock. So I'm hoping by now you should know what happens at Castle Rock and why that's significant. If not, so it will become clear as we annotate together. If you found this chapter analysis and annotation valuable, obviously there's a number of other chapters from the book and an annotation guide as well that might help. So first thing we're going to annotate, which I've already done, is 208. Eric looked down at him through a mask of dried blood. So red becomes a nice little symbol in this chapter, and masks as well to a lesser extent. And so I've got the symbol of blood just there, and I've added red because as reading and annotating this chapter I noticed that coming up often. Then we have, "That's them," said Piggy. "They blinded me, see? That's Jack Merridre. You call an assembly? Ralph, we got to decide what to do." So I've got that annotated in green for leadership. Then, "Blow the conch," said Piggy. "Blow as loud as you can." So there's the symbol, the motif rather, of the conch that runs all throughout the book. 210, "But they stole it and the signal's out and we can't ever be rescued." So this is the fire as symbolic of rescue and the old world, and a logical process of kind of attempting to keep to the idea of rescue. Then, "You can take spears if you want, but I shan't." So this is, just to give a bit of context, this is Piggy and Ralph and Sam and Eric, the kind of last remaining logical democratic group, and they're going to go to Jack's tribe and their hiding place, well, not so much hiding place, but their kind of stronghold at Castle Rock. So, "You can take spears if you want, but I shan't," says Piggy. "What's the good? I'll have to be led like a dog anyhow." "Yes, laugh. Go on, laugh. There's them on this island as would laugh at anything. And what happened? What's grown-ups gonna think? Young Simon was murdered, and there was that other kid what had a mark on his face. Who's seen him since we first come here?" So this is kind of Piggy's, basically, like he's given up on this point. He doesn't trust either side of the boys anymore. He doesn't trust Jack's tribe, and he doesn't really trust his own side either. So he says they can take spears if they want, but they're leading him like a dog. So he's kind of, I don't know, like a lamb to the slaughter almost, like he's going defenseless while they're at least prepared to fight. And laughter is a symbolic element here that to him is the opposite of grown-upness or civilization or those sort of things, because laughing leads to murder according to him. So young Simon was murdered, and there was that other kid that had a mark on his face. So that's pretty significant because he's kind of, I don't know if you want to put, repression or something like that, but a psychological reading is appropriate here. The kind of flippant way that he's able to talk about this boy what had a mark on his face, a boy they never learnt the name of, but they presume died, and how flippantly he can just throw that out there. For 211, we're going to just draw a box around this whole section because it's quite significant. So again, I'm going to him with this conch in my hand. I'm going to hold it out. Look, I'm going to say, "You're stronger than I am and you haven't got asthma." You can see I'm going to say, and with both eyes, "But I do not ask for my glasses back, not as a favour. I don't ask for you to be a sport." I'll say, "Not because you're strong, but because what's right. What's right's right. Give me my glasses." I'm going to say, "You go too." So Piggy's whole approach, and this is my bad drawing of a conch, Piggy's whole approach is that this is basically his last appeal to logic. So he is going there as an orator rather than someone powerful or a leader. His glasses are his last sort of vestige of civilization that's been stripped away from him. Obviously I said asthma, but obviously it's just asthma, but that's kind of a throwback to how he phrased it earlier in the book. So, "He'll be painted," said Sam timidly. "You know how he'll be." So I'm going to draw 4 little lines, which to me are kind of war paint type paint marks. And so this is, obviously the paint represents that Jack is savage and that they're trying to prepare for his savagery. So the fact that he's painted is not a neutral thing, but something that dictates how fearful they should be of him and his control. 212. Piggy sought in his mind for words to convey his passionate willingness to carry the conch against all odds. So he's talking about democracy. He still firmly believes, even kind of beyond its actual power which is now left at this point and no one really trusts him anymore, he still clings to that idea. You could probably talk about World War II and think about the ways that we're probably talking about Winston Churchill and Adolf Hitler in this situation, but that obviously a tyrannical approach to government is a lot more quicker and more expedient in a war context, and so this is kind of what he's driving at here. He knows that the best way would be for someone to just take the lead in this situation, but for whatever reason he's sticking to his belief in democracy, the conch, and logic. So the quote has a lot of layers to it there. So then, again, following along that theme, we ought to comb our hair, only it's too long. And then Eric says, I've got both socks left in the shelter, so we could pull them over our heads like caps, sort of. Piggy, we could find some stuff and tie your hair back. And then, like a girl, no, of course not. Then we must go as we are, and they won't be any better. So this is civilization, but we're starting to see how the kind of flaws of civilization, like obviously being so fearful of appearing as a girl is quite a negative aspect of kind of gender roles in society, that they can see that as such a negative thing to be. And so we're sort of set up with the dichotomy of the benefits and also the weaknesses of democracy and civilization. So here Golding's trying to say that democracy, kind of people cling to democracy as if it's the only way, and maybe that's not the best idea. And then here he starts to show the way that civilization, or the civilization that we cling to, may also be something that's not necessarily that positive, which he'll continue later on. Well, we won't be painted, said Ralph, because we aren't savages. So again, paint represents savagery, and being unpainted, or natural, I guess, is something that is to be prized. And I've just circled the word propitiatingly, which is a word I do not know the definition for. I'll probably pause the video at the end and come back and tell you what they mean, just out of personal interest. There was no sign left of the storm, and the beach was swept clean like a blade that had been scoured. So again, the island is always symbolic of the boy's mindset and of different things like that. So here there was no sign left of the storm, and the beach was swept clean like a blade that has been scoured. So kind of like it's a clean slate, things have been washed away, things are now different, and also there's a threat of violence as with a sword. 2:15, am I safe? Quavered Piggy, I feel awful. You can see who I am, he shouted, stop being silly. So this is basically Piggy standing at the bottom of Castle Rock. And we know, due to the foreshadowing, that there is a rock with a little lever underneath that could quite easily kill Piggy. And so here we see just how lacking in confidence he is approaching Castle Rock and Jack's tribe. 2:16, freed by the paint, they had tied their hair back and were more comfortable than he was. Ralph made a resolution to tie his own back later. So earlier they talked about, maybe they could tie their hair back, but they had too many inhibitions, too much civilization, too much logic, too much fear of being appeared, feminine or female. And so Jack's tribe, they're being more in touch with their own true selves, I guess, is the suggestion, and they're just being natural and free. They've accepted their state, their savage, natural state, whereas Ralph and Piggy have not, and Sam and Eric, of course. Roger took his hands off the lever and leaned out to see what was going on. So Roger is standing at the top of, don't know why there's an extra C in there. Roger is standing at the top of Castle Rock with the lever and the large stone. So the fact that he's mentioned, he's obviously alluding to the fact that he will eventually do something with the rock. Then 2:17, the sniggering of the savages became a loud derisive jeer. So they're sniggering, which, as we know, is a symbol for wild abandon, kind of letting go of your natural civilized state. You pinched Piggy's specs, said Ralph breathlessly. You've got to give them back. So this is very much like sort of a rules approach. He's chastising him as a teacher would. You've done the wrong thing. You need to make it better. I say, you voted for me for chief. Didn't you hear the conch? You played a dirty trick. We'd have given you fire if you asked for it. So again, we're focusing on rules, and they're trying to appeal to his human nature, his civilization, which at this point, due to the the imagery of the hair being tied back and the laughing, we're starting to think maybe there's not much of that left. Then truculently, again I've circled that and I'll add the definition at the end. Truculently is basically not willingly but in a more faulting way, but I'll find a better definition than that to be specific. Ralph, remember what we came for, the fire, my specs. So this is kind of the big boss fight basically taking place, and Piggy's standing on the side not assisting, and then he kind of cuts in and says, Ralph, remember what we came for, the fire, my specs. So these are the two key motifs of firstly rescue, but also civilization and the old world and, you know, logical thinking and so on. And so as Ralph is kind of enjoying, well, don't know about enjoying, but he's involved in the punch up and kind of becoming more savage as a result, Piggy is still kind of standing back, commentating and trying to refocus on what they should be doing. Then 219, your only hope is keeping a signal fire going as long as there's light to see. Then maybe a ship will notice the smoke and come and rescue us and take us home. So again, rescue and the fire is, according to them, still their only hope. And rescue is still something they're clinging to, even at this late stage in the story. We tried to keep the fire going, but we couldn't. So we're talking about the kind of the futility that they're starting to feel at this point of all the work that they've put in, but they couldn't maintain, basically due to the breakup of the tribe and them being left with so few people to continue. Look at that. Call that a signal fire? That's a cooking fire. Now we'll eat. Now you'll eat and there'll be no smoke. Pardon me. So this is showing there's more than one type of fire. There's the signal fire, which is what they're talking about, which is very smoky. And then there's a simple cooking fire, which doesn't help them to be visible to people not on the island, but helps them to survive and to eat, which is, of course, a form of savagery. So again, clear juxtaposition between the signal fire, which is very smoky and alludes to rescue, and the cooking fire, which alludes to simple savagery and, of course, hunting, because you only need a fire if you're cooking meat, and you only need meat if you're a successful hunter, as Jack's tribe have become. 220, Sam and Eric protested out of the heart of civilization. So this is a very strange phrasing, and to me very significant. Sam and Eric, as we know before, they were Sam and Eric. I think I talked about this in the last chapter annotation. They were Sam and Eric, and at this point they've become Sam and Eric. So they become run together, they become one person, they've joined the sort of dictator, and they've become less individual as a result. They've become part of the crowd. So Sam and Eric protested out of the heart of civilization. So again, very strange wording. So you really want to unpack that and use that as a quote in your writing. See, they do what I want, says Jack. So again, there's leadership. I should probably go back to actually highlighting that. So leadership is there, and then above is an example of corruption. So Sam and Eric have been corrupted simply by the fact that their name now appears run together, but also the fact that they protest out of the heart of civilization. Then 221, we've got the metaphor of Ralph was a shock of hair and Piggy a bag of fat. And that's a nice metaphor, so we'll note that down. So Golding uses this metaphor to show that Ralph has become a little bit more wild, a little bit more savage, and Piggy is simply a mere bag of fat. So he's relying basically purely on his intellect, on his logic. Whereas Ralph has become a shock of hair, he's become more savage, and Piggy has remained in his logical state. Which is better, to be a pack of painted niggers like you are, or to be sensible like Ralph is? So again, Golding is showing the way that civilization isn't really all it's cracked up to be, so to speak. So he talked about gender roles and how the males fearing, even appearing to be female, and obviously, especially as a modern audience, we see that as a very negative thing. And then he's got here, which is better, to be a pack of painted niggers like you are, or to be sensitive like Ralph is. So this might just be me reading from a modern conception, but I would view this very clearly as Golding trying to show the negative aspects of civilization. So as civilization is kind of, and logic is at its death here in this final scene, or penultimate scene, I guess, second last, he's trying to show the way that civilization cracks up under pressure. And so he's probably talking about the war and maybe how Britain responded in negative ways based on the fear that they felt. But that could be drawing too long a bow. It's up to you to decide if you agree with me or believe what I'm saying. Top of 222, which is better, to have rules and agree or to hunt and kill? So yeah, this is a good, probably one of the better quotes of the chapter, just because it so plainly and so simply lays out the dichotomy between savagery, rules, agreement, democracy, the conch, all those symbols, the signal fire contrasted with hunting, tribalism, spears, hunting, killing, and being following a dictator, being a part of a group rather than a free-thinking individual. So those are the very two clear dichotomies there. And then obviously something significant is happening here. The rock struck Piggy a glancing blow from chin to knee. The conch exploded into 1,000 white fragments and ceased to exist. So obviously cease to exist is a very strange expression out of context, but of course we know the symbolic element, so we know that this is the end of all of those things that we've been running together: democracy, logic, free thinking, individualism, all those sort of things. And now that has ceased to exist. And Piggy fell 40 feet and landed on his back across that square red rock in the sea. So again, red has come up. The significance of the square is less clear to me, but that's something you could form your own opinions about. So we've got a red square surrounded by water in the sea. So you could just say something simple like red denotes death or risk or danger or something, but it's up to you to draw your own conclusion from this chapter. Top of 223, Piggy's arms and legs twitched a bit like a pig's after it had been killed. So they're drawing a very clear comparison between the pig that was killed earlier and Piggy himself, and showing that both are, bags of fat, to refer back to his earlier quote. Both are at this point useless, or only useful to sustain the tribes in a food sense rather than any logical thinking sense. And then the tribe, screaming now like the chief, began to advance. So this might not appear instantly significant, but similar to the Sam and Eric earlier, where Sam and Eric becomes a run-together word that has changed, this phrase, I'm chief, and the word chief is relatively new. People have talked about being the leader and being different things, but this is the first time that he denotes himself the chief. And obviously a chief is not a prime minister, and it's not a, it's not a president, it's not a democratically elected leader. A chief is typically, you're talking about what we call Orientalism, or the other. Chief has connotations of, basically this kind of concept, the N-word, and being part of a tribe, rather than anything else. So from henceforth, at least in this chapter, Jack is no longer referred to as Jack, but he is rather referred to as the chief. So the chief stopped by the pig, turned and held up his hands. So his form of leadership has changed, even in the way it is expressed. So he's now the chief. He's no longer Jack, he's no longer a boy, he's the chief. And this is very significant. And then 224, the chief spoke to him angrily. So again, the chief is now his denotation, that's what he's called. The hangman's horror clung around him. So this is where we get a really interesting contrast. So the chief is Jack, and I don't know why I'm writing that. Jack, and Ralph is now the hangman's horror. So he has his own form of leadership, which is the fact that he is now a murderer. He's killed someone, and that gives him a certain power, a certain gravitas. So the hangman's horror clung around him. The chief said no more to him, but looked down at Sam and Eric. The chief snatched one of the few spears that were left and poked Sam in the ribs. So violence begets violence. Jack has spoken angrily. Why aren't you on watch? Roger looked at him gravely. I just came down. And the hangman's horror clung down to him. So the chief kind of tries to command him, to order him to do something, but Ralph shrugs that off because now he has the hangman's horror clung around his neck. He has a certain level of power. And then, you got to join the tribe. You let me go. And me, the chief snatched one of the few spears that were left and poked Sam in the ribs. Pardon me. What do you mean by it, said the chief fiercely. What do you mean by coming with spears? What do you mean by not joining my tribe? So the significance of the way that they approached things is very significant. So the fact that they came with spears but were not killed is significant, and Piggy came without spears and was killed. So I'm annotating orange, which is for me symbolic of power. And then again, Roger edged past the chief, only just avoiding pushing him with his shoulder. The yelling ceased, and Sam and Eric lay looking up in quiet terror. Roger advanced upon them as one wielding a nameless authority. So I'm no longer using the colour for leadership, rather I'm using the colour for power. So I'm going to add that clearly. So power is what we're talking about at this point, rather than leadership. The only thing that is left is fear of violence and fear of being killed, being murdered. So there now is a bit of a dichotomy between Roger, who's just killed someone willfully and on purpose, and the chief, who hasn't recently murdered someone or killed anyone. And so there's a little bit of a power imbalance that has happened between Roger and Jack, who is now referred to as the chief. So he's able to edge past the chief, almost nudging him with his shoulder, and kind of that shows quite significantly how powerful he is at this point. Alright, that's chapter 11. Now I'll just jump into some quick definitions. Okay, so just to jump back in, propitiatingly is to appease or conciliate. So conciliate is basically make up something that's been done wrongly. So I hadn't, Ralph said loudly, I knew it all the time, I hadn't forgotten. And Piggy nods in an agreeable, conciliatory way. So he's saying, yes, I believe you. Okay, so I was pretty close earlier. Truculently means basically willing to be violent, or warning of violentness. So a truculent speech is one that warns of violence or threatens violence, so kind of saber-rattling in that situation. And obviously contextually that makes perfect sense, because they are squaring off truculently and then they go on to fight one another. Alright, so as I said, that's all of chapter 11. There's a number of other chapters. I haven't done the whole book, but I've done a couple. If you found these helpful, thanks for watching.